Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Washington Gun Law TV. I am Washington Gun Law President William Kirk. Thanks for joining us. Well, as we know, earlier this month, the ATF's new rules on frames and receivers went into effect, and I've been wanting to do a bunch of videos to educate you, the lawful and responsible gun owners around the country, about what it means to you, but the ATF, for whatever reason, has got me preoccupied with trigger issues. This is an opportunity to sit down and start breaking this down in simple English so that everyone can understand what does this rule do, what doesn't it do, and most importantly, what does it mean to you? So today, we got a really important topic to discuss. So let's spend a few minutes and talk about what the ATF's new rules on unfinished frames and receivers really means to you. Okay, so the issue we're talking about today is ATF Rule 2021R-05F. You all know it as the ATF's new rules on frames and receivers. Now, we're going to talk about three things here today. We're going to talk about what this rule does and doesn't do, okay? We're going to talk about what it means to you when it comes to unfinished frames and receivers, what we call 80% lowers, and what the ATF is now going to call personally made firearms. And that's really the main subject of this video, as well as topic number 3, which is, how are they going to enforce this rule? Okay, first issue, what does this rule do and doesn't do? Well, it provides a definition for frames and receivers, which we've never had before. It identifies specifically which part of a frame or receiver actually constitutes the serialized part, and we've already done a video on that in which we showed some diagrams. And yes, it is the parts that we would expect to be the frame or receiver of any particular platformed firearm. The rule also addresses 80% lower frames and receivers, okay? And we're going to be talking about that quite a bit in this video. And then finally, it talks about 80% or unfinished frames and receivers that are parts of kits, something that I know many of you are interested in. Now, let's talk about what this rule doesn't do, okay? Despite the fact that there was a lot of panic a year ago about what this rule may or may not do, this rule does not require the serialization of every component of the firearm. Only one component of each particular firearm is required to be serialized. So no, you don't need to get your upper serialized. You don't need to get your bolt carrier serialized. If you're buying separate triggers, not from Rare Breed or Big Daddy Unlimited, then you do not need serial numbers on the triggers or in that. It is the traditional lower frame or receiver that we are accustomed to having to be serialized. And for more information, you can check that out on this video right here. Now, one of the first things it does is, as defining frame or receiver, it basically now says the term frame will be used when we are talking about handguns and pistols, and the term receiver will be used when we are talking about long guns, so your rifles and shotguns and other destructive devices. Now, let's talk about what this rule does as it relates to unfinished frames and receivers, or what many of you call 80% lowers, okay? Because it does some very significant things here, and that's going to create a panic. And when we get to the end, we're going to tell you that it's probably not as big of a deal as you think for the firearms that you may be in possession of moving forward. This does have a radical change on how you will conduct your business moving forward, okay? Now, here is what the ATF official statement is about why they developed a rule for unfinished frames and receivers. The ATF, according to their own words, stated, in addition, the final rule addresses partially complete, disassembled, or non-functional frames or receivers and provides standards that the industry and the public can apply to better determine whether the component has reached the stage of manufacture to be regulated as a frame or receiver. This makes clear that the frame or receiver includes a partially complete frame or receiver, including a part kit that is designed to or may be readily be completed, assembled, restored, or otherwise converted to function as a frame or receiver. So, here is the new rule moving forward. If you have purchased an unfinished frame or receiver, but it can be readily converted to a functional frame or receiver, that you can call it an 80% lower moving forward, but we're going to call them here at Washington Gun Law 83% lowers, because you get an extra 3% of completion, because those shall now come with serial numbers, which means you're going to be going through a 4473 background check, whatever your state is requiring you to do, as if you were purchasing any other completed frame or receiver or firearm. Now, I want you to pay very careful attention to these words, because what constitutes a unfinished frame that's close enough that it now constitutes a frame, and what just constitutes a chunk of metal, is really contingent upon these words right here. To better determine whether the component has reached the stage of manufacture to be regulated as a frame or receiver. And so the bottom line is the ease of work which is necessary to take the unfinished frame or receiver and turn it into a completed frame or receiver is going to determine whether the ATF views this to be a regulated part or a non-regulated part. Now, they've given us a couple of examples, and the first one comes from the kits, okay? So we get this unfinished frame or receiver. It comes with a jig. It comes with all of the drill bits necessary. It comes with the instructions on how to turn this into a completed frame or receiver. What is the ATF going to say with that? That is a frame or receiver, and if you are purchasing that, you're going to need to have that serialized by the FFL, and you're going to go through a 4473. If FFLs have these on the shelves now, they have a time period by which they have to serialize them before they can offer them for sale. Now, the ATF also says, like in this example right here, that this part has not actually reached the stage of manufacture and it can be readily completed. In fact, what the ATF says here is that a billet or blank of an AR variant receiver without critical interior areas having been indexed, machined, or formed, that is not solid, distributed, or possessed with instructions, jigs, templates, equipment, or tools such that may be readily completed is not a receiver. So again, the farther away we get from completion, the less likely it is that the ATF is going to say that this is a regulated part requiring a serial number. And the test that is to be used to determine where on the spectrum does this particular unfinished frame or receiver lie, of course, lies with the discretion of the ATF, always bad news. And the criteria by which they are supposed to be using are stated as follows. When classifying such a kit, the director may consider any associated templates, jigs, molds, equipment, tools, instructions, guides, or marketing materials that are sold, distributed, or possessed with the item or kit, or otherwise made available by the seller or distributor of the item or kit to the purchaser or recipient of the item or kit. So again, even in a much more raw format, but with all the tools and equipment necessary and instructions to complete it, that could take what is otherwise a very raw piece of material and have it now viewed in the eyes of the ATF as being a frame or receiver requiring serialization and a 4473. So yes, is there such thing as an 80% lower from this day forward? No, there isn't really. What we would traditionally call 80% lowers, which require some craftsmanship, some work to be done in order to complete it. Now, I'm not making light of it. I understand that not just anybody can do this and you can't just figure out how to do it in 5 minutes. I understand it requires some skill and craftsmanship. But that being said, it is done with a great deal of frequency. And so therefore, what we traditionally call 80% lowers are now going to be sold in a format that I'm calling the 83% lower, because they're going to look exactly the same as what you purchased in the past. They're just going to have a serial number. And the process by which you purchase them are going to be radically different, because they're not just going to show up from UPS or FedEx. Instead, you're going to have to go down to your FFL, fill out a Form 4473 as you would with any other receiver, frame, or other firearm, and pass a background check before you can take possession of it. In some states that have mandatory statutory waiting periods, yes, you are in fact going to be subject to the waiting period as well before you can take possession of this unfinished frame or receiver. Okay, and then the third issue, and this is the one that's got everyone all hot and bothered, so I want to clear this up, is let's talk about personally made firearms. Now, the ATF came up with this terminology, personally made firearms. In Washington State, we call them untraceable firearms, but both of those terms are much better than what mainstream media and the gun grabbing community uses, which is ghost guns, okay? Personally made firearms, are they unlawful moving forward? No, they are not. Can you make a personally made firearm with an unserialized receiver moving forward? That is effective this date moving forward. Can you make an otherwise untraceable firearm according to federal law? No, you cannot. Now, here's the big question. What about all those otherwise untraceable firearms, personally made firearms, that you may have in your possession right now? How long or when do you have to go and get them serialized? The answer is you don't. Okay? And that's the most important thing I want you to understand here. There is no requirement that you take any previously manufactured or made or assembled, personally made, untraceable firearm down to an FFL and get it serialized. There is no requirement. ATF is not going to show up at your door and demand that they take a look at your untraceable firearms. They should have no record of them whatsoever, because when you bought it, it was nothing but a chunk of aluminum, okay? So they're not going to be showing up at your door demanding serialization of these. However, and this is the big however here, if a personally made firearm is currently in the inventory of an FFL, it needs to be serialized. And if you take a personally made, unserialized firearm to an FFL, and that firearm has to be checked into the inventory of the FFL, that is, it's staying overnight, or it's being transferred or sold, or for whatever reason, if the FFL has to take that into inventory, they by federal law are now required to serialize it. Okay, let me repeat that. If the firearm goes to an FFL and it doesn't just have they worked on it for an hour and the gun gets to go home with you, that's fine. It doesn't go into FFL inventory. But once they possess it overnight, it has to, by federal law, go into their inventory. And now, by operation of federal law, they will have to serialize it. The firearm cannot be returned to you until it is serialized. And just so we're clear, the definition of a personally made firearm under federal regulation now is defined as follows. A PMF is a firearm including a frame or receiver completed, assembled, or otherwise produced by a person other than a licensed manufacturer and without a serial number placed by a licensed manufacturer at the time the firearm was produced. Now, if an FFL takes a personally made firearm in which the manufacturer, the person, the civilian who built it, has serialized it in some fashion, the FFL will be required to both record that serial number and affix to it a new serial number consistent with the mandates of this federal rulemaking. Okay, and then finally for FFLs, and we're going to be doing a whole nother series of videos on this just exclusively for you, but this is important. Any firearm that you had in your possession prior to the enactment of this rule needs to be serialized within 60 days. However, any personally made, unserialized firearm that you come into possession of after the enactment of this rule, or basically from this point moving forward, has to be serialized within 7 days. And then, of course, you can imagine there's a litany of new record-keeping requirements on the FFL industry, which we will cover in a separate video. Okay, so in a nutshell, what this law does is it defines frames and receiver. It identifies which part of the firearms are frames and receiver. And then, more importantly, it gives us a definition about unfinished frame or receiver and some guidance from when an unfinished or 80% lower is complete enough that it has to be treated as if it is a completed frame or receiver, and therefore the 4473, the background checks, waiting periods, if you have them. So that's the first thing the rule does. The second thing the rule does is it provides very strict guidance for what constitutes a chunk of metal, what constitutes a unfinished frame or receiver, and when does that requirement of federal regulation kick in. And third, and most importantly, what it does is it talks about personally made firearms. And yes, you can still make personally made firearms. And most importantly, if you have personally made and unserialized firearms, there is no need for you to go out and have them serialized unless they end up in an FFL inventory by having to stay there overnight or for a longer duration of time. Listen, we're going to have a lot more videos about this. We're going to do some stuff related exclusively just to the FFLs and the marking requirements that are required on this as well. In the meantime, you may have more questions about this or anything else related to your Second Amendment rights. And if you do, remember, you can always contact us at WashingtonGunLaw.com, or you can call us directly at 425-765-0487. Now, let's remember, part of being a lawful and responsible gun owner, like we talk about all the time here at Washington Gun Law, is to know what the law is in every situation, how it applies to you in any instance that you may find yourself. Until next time, thanks for watching. Stay safe.